predicted, they're coming for homeschooling. A few years ago, the attacks on homeschoolers were subtle and somewhat carefully framed. Not anymore. With Sleepy Joe in charge, they're coming for your kids. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on this craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we start with the latest attacks on Christian homeschooling as mainstream media becomes increasingly concerned that public school propaganda is not reaching those outside the system. So we've got to take down. I saw a recent statistic that about 3 million more American parents have dropped out of public schools since COVID. That's a huge number. That would effectively more than double the number of homeschool families we have in this country. And there's a lot for the public schools to be worried about. We think about why this is happening. Well, does it have something to do with the fact that the public schools refused to teach your kids all year long? They groused and they fought. They did not want the schools open. They did not take seriously the online component. They were unprepared for it. They completely botched online learning. And more than almost any other industry or business in this country, they still aren't sure they want your kids to come back to school. How about the fact that over the course of this COVID past year, they've been quietly slipping critical race theory, anti-American, anti-white, absolute racist curriculum in? How about the sexualization of your kids that we've been documenting on the Dr. Duke Show? You wonder why homeschool is becoming a greater and a much more likely alternative for parents.
Well, yeah, and we've reported several different times now on this show about how the growth of the homeschool movement is happening out there. So naturally, if there are more homeschooling parents and students out there, that means there are less in the public school. And since the public schools want your money, they're going to come for your kids. And so we have a story basically discussing just another example of someone from the left who's putting it out there in the mainstream media that they want your kids. And
this woman is particularly vile, though, if you look at her history.
Well, then.
Jill Filipovic.
Yes. Or Filipovich. We'll see what it is.
A lawyer and a feminist author.
And of course, her articles have been in, Washington Post and the Times and the Guardian, all of the publications that
liberal trash bases.
Okay, you can call it that, or the ones that are getting the attention of everyone, even though no one actually reads them anymore. But anyway, so Jill Filipovich, or Filipovich, lefty, is basically also saying how not only are you a right-winger, that's what you're called if you homeschool, you undermine your children's basic safety and right to an education if you, mom and dad, choose to homeschool and keep your kids out of those public schools.
So explain to me how keeping your kids out of public schools, where kids by the hundreds have been shot over the last 20 years, where they've been exposed to drugs, where they've been raped and fondled by teachers, where they get to sit in front of cameras and watch teachers lick other people's nipples. Explain to me how you are endangering your kids by keeping them home, number one. And number two, you're also endangering your kids' right to an education if you homeschool. This is, to me, the height of hypocrisy. Every metric we have, including the NAEP scores, show that our kids are not learning how to read, they're not learning how to write, they're not learning how to do math at the grade level they should. They're way behind where they should be. Our schools, public schools, have utterly and completely failed the let's get your kids basically literate test. Instead, they have become petri dishes. They've become experimental rooms of classrooms where we sexualize them, where we anti-Americanize them. We teach them bogus history and civics, 1619 nonsense. We've substituted actual learning for social indoctrination. So according to Jill Filipovic, right, keeping your kids away from failed intellectual schools that can't educate your kids, but who will make you hate your country, your God, and your individuality, that's what is the problem here?
Well, yes, because if you're a conservative parent, meaning you actually just want to teach your kids history, teach your kids how to read and write, teach them how to do arithmetic, just teach them anything that is not on the left. You are then a conservative homeschooling parent, and according to Jill, many of you, most of you, basically, okay, I'll just say it, all of you, lack the necessary credentials and the training to teach properly.
So all those teachers with 4-year degrees can't teach your kids how to read. Can't teach your kids, they don't teach phonics, they teach word sight, they can't teach your kids math. And so with a degree, they can't teach the kids. So you're telling us now that getting the degree should be a precursor for you being allowed to teach kids. That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yes, and you're keeping these children willfully ignorant
of left-wing causes.
Yes, and you're shielding these youth. You're shielding them. And you're doing this because it's going to threaten your religious beliefs.
Why wouldn't a parent in this culture want to shield their kid from radical lefties in their institutions? I mean, can you think of any reasons? We just laid out about 24 in the last bunch of shows this week why you should shield your kid from harm, right? Notice the point. You shielding your kid is projecting your values on them. Send them to our indoctrination camps, and we'll shield them for you and your religion and your maternal control.
And don't forget the cherry on top of this sundae. Of course, if you homeschool your children, you're also a racist.
And a Christian nationalist,
according
right?
to our friend Jill.
Yeah.
You are, if you homeschool, you're clearly a racist. Me just saying cherry on top of a sundae, I'm sure that's racist in some sense.
Well, a 2020 poll found that a not insignificant percentage of parents are likely to homeschool even after the COVID-19 related lockdowns come to an end. And while parents' satisfaction with the quality of their children's education significantly declined in 2020, the percentage of K-12 parents who homeschool doubled, according to a Gallup poll. That would be right. 3 million and another 3 million dropping out.
And see, that ties in then to why the public school is on high alert, because even though we gave them an even crappier education in 2020 than normal, well, we got the K-12 parents who are homeschooling, and that's going up, so that's obviously bad for us, so we need to somehow blame the homeschoolers.
They say homeschooling is dangerous, which is ironic. In contrast, there is plenty of evidence demonstrating that public schools are unsafe for kids.
Stop it.
A 2019 article in the New York Times. The New York Times noted that K through 12 public schools have, quote, this is a quote from the left-wing New York Times about how dangerous public schools are. K-12 schools have become, quote, notorious for failing to recognize and address sexual assault, and employing tactics to intimidate victims and avoid lawsuits. Another 2019 article in Commonweal cited a former advisor of the Department of Education who explained that the aggregate number of children abused in public schools would be larger than in the entire Catholic Church priest scandal. Another DOE advisor has argued that sexual abuse cases in public schools far outnumber those in private Catholic schools.
Well, we got word that you don't need your masks anymore, supposedly, and we got the second largest teachers union, the AFT, saying, you know what? We should be teaching in person in the fall. But in Illinois, their Federation of Teachers, they have demands for what it is that, for them to resume this in-person teaching. And they're going to, of course, use the legislature, the state legislature, to make it law to meet their demands. If passed, the bill that they have would give authority to the state's public health department to set standards and requirements for schools even after the governor's state of emergency is lifted and the pandemic has ended. So even after that, those are the words you need to listen to. Even after the actual scare, pandemic, all that gone, we're still going to have the control.
Even something more subtle.
After.
Notice how a lot of states got around the rule of law. Governors did not have, state legislatures often didn't have the ability to shut down forced mask wearing to social distance. So what happened? Unaccountable public health departments, including here in Wisconsin, they pretended they had the authority that the governor didn't and implemented this self without any legal or legislative or constitutional underwriting to be able to do it. Notice what they're going to do. They don't want departments of education. They want departments of public health from state to state to decide that homeschooling is unsafe and unhealthy on the basis of nothing more than their own left-wing politics.
What's fascinating is that actually the people opposing this include the private parochial school, okay, yeah.
Of course.
And the Chicago public schools. So these are some strange bedfellows, but I'll explain why in a moment. They're also opposing this along with the State Board of Education. So it's really interesting as to who actually is in agreement and disagreement with this. But according to the Illinois Policy Institute, this bill amends the Department of Public Health powers and duty duties law of the state's Civil Administrative Code to require the IDPH to establish rules governing such things as personal protective equipment, cleaning and hygiene, social distancing, occupancy limits, symptom screening, and protocols for isolating sick students and staff at school. Here's more. IDPH is charged with disseminating information about the requirements to the schools with the help of the Illinois State Board of Education. The IDPH, along with the local health departments, must enforce the rules by investigating complaints about non-compliant schools and taking actions such as closing the lunchrooms or the libraries or the classrooms or any other spaces in the school until these violations have been remedied. All right. Well, the kicker is the bill actually is amending the Illinois School Code to make offering in-person instruction contingent on a school's meeting of all that criteria that was developed by the IDPH. And basically the private and religious schools are kind of SOL, as Trip Rogers, who's the superintendent of Lutheran Schools of Central Illinois, said. Schools under his jurisdiction are already following all of the, the local advice, because guess what? In local areas, they know you better than anyone in county, state, federal areas. Local should know you best. Anyway, and he's saying that this, one-size-fits-all thing coming from Springfield, which is the capital, might not take into account relevant differences among schools. And he further questioned whether schools will have any input into the formulation of these guidelines and worried that the bill that they're making could prevent schools from being in session and educating our children.
As we saw in the previous story, as part of the previous story, the left is coming after the disseminators of homeschool curriculum, particularly for evangelicals, coming after Bob Jones, Becca Press, and some of the others, because they're tied into what the left now calls Christian nationalism. When you hear the words Christian nationalism, think about what's happening here. We're tying Christianity inherently to insurrection. So what they've done very clever with language is they're making Christianity seem as if all Christians are part of Trumpian insurrection. And if you educate your kids at home, you might as well be educating them in a militia. Beware of this. Christian nationalism. It's not a thing, but they're making it a thing. They're tarring Christianity now with the brush of radical right-wing ideology, and it's not true.
Now, I had told you that even the Chicago public schools were against this law being taken into effect. And it's because they've had this long war going on. We've heard about it, Chicago teachers unions, they don't want the students to be in. Even the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who is no friend of the right, at one point said, hey, get your kids back in school because, money. But the Chicago schools were involved in this long war and about the standards, protocols, all that. And so this law would basically erase the rules and substitute even more stringent requirements. So they don't want that to happen either. So it's, in their minds, lose-lose, I guess. Well, who'd have thunk it? I guess I wouldn't. A surge in homeschooling among families is happening in black churches. We have Pastor Cecil Blyle of More Great Ministries Church in Louisville, Kentucky, said that he and his fellow pastors have seen a surge in homeschooling among families in black churches in Louisville, as well as a push to start private schools and charter schools by black pastors. And I guess you would hope that this is happening not only in this specific instance, but all across the nation for all churches and all ethnicities and just everywhere. Basically, get your kids out of public schools, get them into private and homeschooling.
One of the most ironic aspects of all of this Black Lives Matter stuff is that the public schools who completely retooled the schools to cater to struggling African-American populations, who have built curriculum around African-Americans and their lack of quote-unquote equity in this country. And yet, every day, every month, every year, we see in the public schools, all dedicated to Black Lives Matter and race awareness, it's still the black kids are doing the worst. Still the black kids who fall behind, the inner city black kids. So for all of their progressive gerrymandering, they are turning out kids just as poorly educated. Maybe the only real place for blacks is to educate their kids at home. Let intelligent black and mothers and fathers sit down with their kids and trust, like every other demographic in this country, those black moms and dads have the will, have the knowledge, have the ability to use technology to educate their kids for their own purposes, for their local communities, for their religious backgrounds, for the sake of those kids. alter a statement by Jesus. What profiteth an African American to gain all the simple sympathy of the left and still remain ignorant about subject matter? Right? What profits African Americans to get all of this treacly, we feel bad for you, whiny cryingness, and in the end of the day, still score worse than everybody else? How does that help you?
And this goes right along with what we just found out based on the U.S. Census Bureau data, that homeschooling in the Black community has gone in 1 year's time, just from fall, or not even like a full year, just the summer basically, from spring 2020 to fall 2020, from 3.3% Black students were being homeschooled to 16.1%.
Yep.
So that Black Lives Matter, public school teachers unions, that's a red flag for them. They need to have control over the Black community. That's what they've always wanted. So when they see that homeschooling population increasing, they're going to come out for you, and they're going to try and get rid of homeschooling altogether.
Self-determination for African Americans, the ability to control their lives, their children's lives, and thereby their children's education and the education of their children and the success of their children in the future, that is poison to liberal social planners. They need blacks at the bottom of the rung so they can keep screaming about this, demanding more money, which gets siphoned off to white teachers and white educrats and white union leaders. No. Self-determination on behalf of African Americans, the ability to take their kids out of failed left-wing schools and to give them a proper homeschool, that is absolutely like garlic to a liberal vampire. They need those kids dependent. African American moms and dads now have the ability to make them less dependent by taking their education under their own wings.
And like we were talking about Pastor Blisle and what they're doing in Louisville, Kentucky, basically in all of Kentucky, they made it so we need this to be happening in state legislatures across the nation, where lawmakers are overriding governor, in this case Andy Bashar, who's a Democrat, his veto of school choice bill that allows students to attend private or schools outside of their home districts. And basically their bill was intended to ensure a school district's local effort funds follow a student to the district in which a student is enrolled. Okay, so they were able to override that. And so then in terms of what's happening in the Black community, in the churches specifically, Pastor Blisle says, I'm seeing more Black families interested in homeschooling and joining co-ops or small schools, as polls suggest. And then he emphasized the trend is allowing for more involvement in K-12 education by Black churches.
Black empowerment is poison to liberal social planners. We are reveling in the world of H.L. Menken here on the Dr. Duke Show, one of a series of really great individuals who is willing to stand up to a completely corrupt government, to an increasingly corrupt government, who was one of those great thinkers and one of those great writers and orators who's willing to stand up and confront this slide into democracy, which is going to be very quickly a slide into tyranny, to call out government for its venality. And H.L. Mencken, as an American, he's the first American we've done this with since Mark Twain. And really in the 20th century, he is one of the preeminent government curmudgeons that we have in this country. So let's take a look at some more quotes from H.L. Mencken. Quote, if a politician found that he had cannibals among his constituents, he would promise them missionaries for dinner. Doesn't that just say it all? I mean, if a politician, whose job, of course, is to protect his own fiefdom and to get rich, not to serve the people, if a politician found he had cannibals among his constituents, he would promise them missionaries for dinner. You'd sell out your own mother. And when I I get that the Republicans are bad too, but tell me this is not a perfect direct description of Chuck Schumer or Adam Schiff or Nancy Pelosi. All right, I mean, down the line you go, Maxine Waters. I mean, it's staggering how deeply populated the progressive cause in Congress is when it comes to this kind of stuff. Go to the next quote. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Right, maybe it's time we wake up and realize that it's a lot more complicated than just opening the borders Joe, maybe there are a lot of secondary, tertiary, all sorts of airy problems with your simple solutions to everything. Telling Israel to stand down seems awfully simple, doesn't it? As the bombs keep raining down. How about this one? The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. This would be the P dossier. This would be Russian collusion. This would be the so-called insurrection. Yada, yada, yada. 4 years of the Trump administration, every week a new scandal, almost none of them with any veracity, almost none of them are even mentioned anymore now that you finally succeeded in getting the orange monster removed. That's exactly what he says, and I'll give you one more. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. As we become more of a democracy and less of a constitutional republic, the president looks a lot more like us. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. We move toward a lofty ideal. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the democratic land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron.
All right, just a quick reminder to please download our Freedom Project Media app. All you have to do is search Freedom Project in your app store. And if you enjoy our content, please support us by joining the Patriot Club. Your one-time $99 tax-deductible donation allows us to bring you all of the stories every day. Simply visit patriotclub.us to get signed up. And of course, we will ship you, as just a little thank you, our signature tumbler. Now we want to take a moment to show some love to our Patriot Club members. And today, we're giving a shout out to Kevin from Neenah, Wisconsin. Kevin, thank you so much for supporting us.
And that wraps up the show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, stay educated, my friends.